This video is part of Design Bytes Season 1, covering game design on The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. All 5 episodes are available to watch now, so make sure you check them out after this one. Season 1 will contain some spoilers, so it's recommended that you play Breath of the Wild first before watching these episodes. Enjoy! Hyrule in The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild is a massive open-world paradise filled to the brim with things to do. Just the act of traversing through it is exciting, because there's so many regions, locales, and unique things to see. But one thing always remains the same no matter where Link explores: the enemies. The absence of enemy variety in such an otherwise fully realized world was really surprising and something I wasn't expecting at all. In retrospect, this might just be my biggest issue with Breath of the Wild. So on this episode of Design Bytes, let's break down why the collection of enemies found in Hyrule is insufficient and how it affects the overall player experience. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild has an absolutely massive open world that easily outsizes any other game I've played before it, and that really can't be understated. I poured more than 300 hours into the game, collecting and finding everything it had to offer, and I was just as determined to fight and destroy every enemy and monster I came across. I left a countless amount of dead Bokoblins, Moblins, and Lizalfos behind as I blazed a path of glory throughout Hyrule, and that's what got me thinking, shouldn't there be more than just these guys? The answer to that is a rhetorical and emphatic yes, but Nintendo must have thought otherwise, because Breath of the Wild is severely lacking in enemy variety. Throughout Hyrule, players will encounter just a handful of different monsters, and listing them off really shows how few there are. Players will meet the following during their adventure: Bokoblins, Moblins, Lizalfos, Wizrobes, Choo-Choos, Octoroks, Pebbits, Keese, Lynels, and those sneaky Yiga clan members. Each of these can have multiple variants, such as a different colored version that's tougher, or one that has an elemental affinity, such as fire or ice. There are also the signature guardians that roam around Hyrule, and some guardian scouts that are placed in shrines. Some enemy classes do have skeletal versions of themselves, and they only appear at night, but those don't really behave that much differently from their living counterparts, and could arguably be classified as a different variation of their living embodiment. Minus mini-bosses, that's a total of only 12 truly unique enemies without including all of their variations. If we include the Guardian variations, that number jumps to 15. I think it's totally fair to include all versions of the Guardians separately because they have more substantial gameplay differences amongst them, but still, that's only 15 enemies before variations are included. To give credit to Breath of the Wild, I do want to point out that if all variants of all enemies are included, the total number clocks in just north of 70. But when broken down like this, it's shocking to see just how few unique monsters there are in the game, and it sticks out to me as the game's biggest missed opportunity. This small assortment of enemies, unsurprisingly, has a long list of large ramifications on the overall game design and experience. The most significant result of having so few enemies in a game of this size is that combat encounters start to feel repetitive and tedious as the game goes on, instead of tense and exciting. Things start to stale later in the game because once an enemy's attack pattern is learned, the challenge becomes how many of them are present at once, instead of how skilled a player is at fighting them. This is mitigated a little bit because enemies can wield different weapon types, which does change the combat strategy. But since players will encounter the same enemies with high frequency, the weapons they wield don't add too much to diversity. A lot of enemy types even attack the same way or have very similar behavior, so there were times where I felt this repetitiveness even when the visuals on screen were different. Another consequence of the low enemy variety is a lost sense of wonder, which admittedly kinda sounds more dramatic than it needs to be, but there is some truth to it. The more and more enemy camps I saw in the distance, the less I felt like I needed to prepare for the unknown, and instead kept wondering which of the 3 main enemy types was going to be there: Bokoblins, Moblins, or Lizalfos. After all, almost every enemy stronghold is filled with one of those 3 types of monsters, and they make up the vast majority of all enemy encounters in the game, so any and all suspense would get lost as I approached them. This feeling of repetition was especially bad at nighttime, because it always meant that battles would now include those skeleton monsters. When that happened, I knew it was time to start avoiding encounters, because after beating up on hundreds of them, I didn't want to fight them anymore. Unfortunately, the world-building elements of Breath of the Wild also suffer from the small selection of enemies. Something that I began to expect in my adventure was that certain regions would be home to certain enemy types, because that's just how realized the world of Hyrule is. I thought that surely, some enemies could only survive in the cold, or maybe some could only be found in the jungle. But Breath of the Wild doesn't really do this at all unless it's a common enemy having a specific affinity in those locations, such as having a fire-breathing Lizalfos near Death Mountain. Even writing about this topic now, I am still stunned that Nintendo didn't go this route with enemies, because it would have made the world feel that much more real and alive. In fairness to Nintendo's designers, I do want to point out that wildlife does adhere to this kind of principle, but I still feel like it was a significant missed opportunities that could have also been applied with the game's monsters. Even Calamity Ganon himself can't escape the world-building problems because of the limited collection of enemies on display. As the omnipresent evil force of Hyrule for over 100 years, you would think that his army of followers and minions would be as vast as the landscape itself. But no, the scarcity of enemy variety prevents players from feeling that way, and it makes the world as a whole feel a lot less threatening. This is actually shown to players with great frequency, because the Blood Moon cutscene that causes enemies to respawn only shows Bokoblins, Moblins, and Lizalfos, and these are the three main enemy types that players will be slaying all game long. Despite all of that, I do want to acknowledge a counterpoint and argue that Nintendo may have gone with this small pool of enemies intentionally, and with good reason. It's most likely true that the vast majority of development resources went into the construction of Hyrule itself along with the physics engine, so there may not have been a lot of them left over for new enemy creation and AI programming. That would totally explain why there are so many variations of the base slate of enemies found within Breath of the Wild, because Nintendo could reuse assets with only slight alterations. In my opinion, it seems like a likely bet that this is what happened. It's also possible that Nintendo felt like the world was so big that encounters would be spread out during a playthrough, which would mitigate the feeling of repetitiveness. I'm not sure that that's actually what players will experience during their adventure, but it is a valid viewpoint. Nintendo may have also felt like the amount of wildlife would make the overall pool of creatures feel larger than it actually is, because some players might not make a distinction between the two. I got a ton of great memories and experiences out of my playtime with The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild, but the absence of enemy variety was easily my biggest gripe with the game. While it never stopped me from enjoying my adventure, it did hamper some important elements of the game, such as making combat stale over time and by negatively affecting world-building components. The variations of each base enemy do help a bit, and Nintendo probably had good reason to go this route. But while I think there's a lot more Nintendo can do with the enemy variety in future Zelda titles, I also think it's fair to call it a weakness of Breath of the Wild.